and welcome. Yes, good morning, one and all. We apologize for the delayed start. We were experiencing some technical difficulties, but we seem to be on stream to engage into a wonderful session this morning. And good morning to one and all from across Trinidad and Tobago, from across the Caribbean region, and those of you joining us from an international audience. And welcome to the Elma Francois Institute for Research and Debate of the Cipriani College of Labor and Cooperative Studies as we commemorate Labor Day in Trinidad and Tobago with a week for weeks. And this is in commemoration of the centenary of the former labor leader, George Weeks. Now, yesterday, we began the week with a very interesting session looking at the life and times of the labor leader, George Weeks. And this morning, we continue on that same vein and we really get into an interesting discussion on public goods, commodification, and inequality. My name is Colin Bartholomew of the Cipriani College of Labor and Cooperative Studies, and I'm pleased to be your moderator this morning. And joining me, I have an esteemed panel to really bring the discussion into light and engage you as we continue in this webinar series. And I'm joined this morning by Mr. Andre Falby, who is an adjunct finance lecturer at the Cipriani College of Labor and Cooperative Studies, UWI Reutech, and the UWI Open Campus. I'm also joined from Barbados by Sister Sanja Messiah, who is the Sub-Regional Secretary for Public Services International, known as PSI, and she's the representative in the Caribbean. And from Albania, we are joined by Dr. Edlira Jaffa, who is the Executive Director of the Online Academy at the Global Labor University. And they are very, very excited to be with us here today, and they will take their turns at the wheel to deliver their presentations this morning on our topic, public goods, commodification, and inequality. So over the next couple hours, we will be engaged, first of all in presentations and then transitioning into a question and answer segment. Now, we are joined on an online platform, so I encourage you to please share, subscribe to the YouTube channel, like, and in the event that you have any questions, you can post them by typing it into the chat box area of the YouTube feed. So when doing that, please ensure that your questions are clear and concise, and as much as possible, direct your question to the respective panel members. So with those words, I think we will get into the presentations. And opening the session today will be led off by Mr. Andre Falby. Now, Mr. Falby is a career banker with 30 years experience in risk management, business lending, corporate and investment banking, and has been involved in financing projects spanning across a wide cross-section of industries, both locally and regionally. He's a graduate of UWI, holds a bachelor's degree in social sciences and an international MBA in finance. And of course, he is adjunct faculty both at the college, UWI Open Campus, and also at the Institute of Banking and Finance of Trinidad and Tobago. And we are pleased to have Mr. Falby just deliver his presentation as we get into the discussion. So I would now turn the floor over to Mr. Falvey, where he can deliver. Andre, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you, Colin. So, hi, good morning all. I'm just going to put my slides up. Okay, so this morning I'm going to talk about public goods this morning, and to lead up the discussion. So first of all, I'm going to ask, well, what exactly is a public good? A public good refers to a commodity or service that is made available to all members of a society. Typically, these services are administered by governments and paid for collectively through taxation. Notice I said paid for. Examples of public goods would include law enforcement, the police force, national defense. And public goods are provided to all members of society without profit. Public goods also refer, in some cases, to more basic goods such as water, access to clean air and safe and clean drinking water. Public goods are not necessarily free. And sometimes that line is blurred because as we all have free access to these public goods, it's easy for us to believe that the goods are in fact free. Also within the realm of public goods, we have the concept of quasi-public goods. Quasi-public goods have characteristics of both private and public goods, including partial excludability, partial rivalry, partial diminishability, and partial rejectability. Examples include roads, tunnels, bridges. So these are the goods where it's available to all, but people have a choice to exclude themselves from taking part in the goods. It's voluntarily. We all have access to a highway, but we don't all have to drive on the highway. You can choose to simply not drive on that highway. Markets for these goods are considered to be incomplete markets, and their lack of provision by free markets would be considered to be inefficient and a market failure. Economics teaches us that the market system can allocate resources, and it is an indicator of how resources should be allocated to produce goods and services for the well-being of all. By demanding a good and a good having enough value to command a price, the market system suggests that this is why this good must be created. With public goods and in some cases quasi-public goods, the market system, if left unchecked, would probably fail to provide the goods in the correct quantity or the correct efficiency that is required. So when that happens, that's basically a market failure. So some of these quasi-public goods and could be electricity, healthcare, education, postal service, water. And, is water a quasi-public good or is it a complete public good? We all need water. We all have a right to water. But, there's a question, should we have free water? I mean, that's a pretty topical issue in Trinidad and Tobago, especially in the events of the past week, has raised that concept of paying for water to the forefront. And just a bit on the market failure. Market failure is an economic situation defined by an inefficient distribution of goods and services in the free market. In market failure, the individual incentives for rational behavior do not lead to rational outcomes for the group. So profit is a rational behavior for the individual. An individual gets involved in a productive and economic enterprise to make a profit. That's good for the individual providing the service. And that individual, going after his rational profit motive provides a good that is to the benefit of people who want to use the good. But of course, if the profit motive overrides everything else, it may lead to the detriment of certain groups in a society, hence a market failure. And market failure has been the main argument for the state to provide public goods. In Trinidad and Tobago, there are several goods that are provided by the public sector. National security and protective services, which is the perfect definition of a public good. And I don't think there's any society where the public is expected to pay directly for national security and protective services. Payment, of course, comes through taxation. Healthcare. In Trinidad and Tobago, we have universal healthcare. Several countries have universal healthcare. In Trinidad, it's done through the regional health authorities and the chronic disease assistance program. And interestingly, because this sort of healthcare has been with us for so long, there is a tendency to take this for granted. The chronic disease assistance program, which is a program where people suffering from chronic disease, such as whether it's heart disease, diabetes, any range of chronic diseases that require normally very expensive medication, have access to this medication free. So someone with diabetes who in the United States might probably require anywhere between $100 to $200 worth of medication per month. Someone suffering from that same disease in Trinidad will be using those same drugs, but the state provides that. And sometimes we forget that, that's the value of those drugs. Electricity, TNTech, being primarily state-owned, is provided by the state. Water, as provided by the Water and Sewerage Authority. Pensions, provided by the National Insurance Board. Housing, provided by the HDC. And of course, education, education, which in most developed and even developing countries is usually provided by the state up to, from primary through secondary level. And in Trinidad and Tobago, there's significant subsidization of education at the tertiary level as well, through programs such as GATE, as well as subventions to regional institutions such as the University of the West Indies. Fuel is also provided by the state through NP marketing. And while fuel is paid for, the subsidization of fuels, almost puts it as a quasi-public good in our context. Privatization of public goods. The two main arguments for the privatization of public goods are based on the desire to eliminate the free rider problem and the introduction of competition to reduce price and increase efficiency. And like everything else, this can be in theory. So sometimes public goods could be privatized with these good intentions in mind. Eliminate the free rider. The free rider would be people who have access to these goods but would not contribute their fair share. And competition tends to will reduce price and increase efficiency. And of course, that happens in theory, not necessarily in practice. Now, the free rider problem, as I mentioned, that's a burden of a sure resource that is created by its use or overuse by people who aren't paying for their fair share of it. And just think of how some people may use water when it's abundant. There's a tendency, if water is flowing in your taps, and water doesn't flow in everybody's taps in Trinidad 24/7, but at times when water is flowing, there's a tendency to waste it because it's there. Somehow there isn't that conscious note that this is a scarce resource, and because it's available now, doesn't mean that it's just in abundant quantities. So water lawns, wash cars with a hose on, and so on. And that goes for other resources, electricity, or even totally free natural resources, fishing, hunting, resources that are natural resources that are available for all. When providers of goods and services are required to compete against each other, they are forced to keep their costs down, respond quickly to the changing demands of the industry and consumers, and strive to satisfy more customers. Now, in the case of Trinidad and Tobago, we've got a classic example of, a state good in the days when it was 100% provided by the state, telecommunications, for example. In the old days, TSTT was a state monopoly. And if we compare the service levels and product offerings of TSTT today, when TSTT faces competition from a range of other services, the TSTT face competition on the fixed phone market, they face competition on the mobile phone services, they face competition on all of the other periphery services, whether it's internet data, cable television. Basically every product that TSTT offers, there is some competition to it. And based on that, I think we can all safely say that even if their service is not perfect today, it's certainly an improvement over what their service was like, 25 years ago when they commanded a monopoly. So that's, I guess, one example of privatization actually working to the benefit of customers. Public-private partnerships has been common across the world and across the region. A public-private partnership involves collaboration between a government agency and a private sector company that can be used to finance, build, and operate projects such as public transportation networks, parks, and utilities. Financing a project through a public-private partnership can allow a project to be completed sooner or make it available or make it possible in the first place. So there are some public goods that require a significant capital outlay. The infrastructure, and I'm thinking something like the highways, for example. And while our experience with highways in Trinidad has been state provided, in other countries, it can be done through public-private partnerships. The Trans-Jamaica Highway in Jamaica, is an example of public-private. And there are times when the infrastructure required can only be done through some sort of public-private partnership in terms of financing and building. Public-private partnerships often involve concessions of tax and other operating revenue, protection from liability or partial ownership rights over nominally public services and property to private sector for-profit entities. And of course, there's no free lunch. So whenever the private sector engages with a government to provide public goods, it's usually not, all for altruistic reasons. There is that profit motive there. So, some concessions would have to be given on both sides. Privatization has been explored in the region, and both privatization and public-private partnership. And I'll use the example of electricity, some regional examples. Trinidad and Tobago. Trinidad and Tobago, electricity is produced and distributed through TNTech and PowerGen. PowerGen, which would be the parent company, the PowerGen shareholders are TNTech, which is state-owned, 51%, the National Enterprises Limited, 10%, which is the NEL is the government's investment holding company. So between TNTech and NEL, that's 61% ownership. So the power gen is basically 61% owned by the states. Maru Energy owns the other 39%. Maru Energy, which is that's a foreign private multinational, owns 39% of TNTech. So in Trinidad and Tobago, electricity generation is almost a classic example of public-private partnership. Grenada, Grenlec is about 62% owned by the government of Grenada. But this is more or less a recent development. This was the Grenada's, the government of Grenada's shareholding in Grenlec was recently acquired, I think just about December 2020 or January 21, they acquired the majority shareholding from the previous operators, WRB. WRB Enterprises is a US-based power company. And it has been regarded, I mean, I guess it's debatable, but Grenlec is considered one of the more efficient providers of electricity in the region. In St. Lucia, Lucilec is a publicly listed company with 10% ownership by the government of St. Lucia. So Lucilec in St. Lucia is, for all intents and purposes, privately owned. But unlike Grenlec, where it was majority owned by a foreign corporation, Lucilec is more widely held. So the general public, the ordinary citizens of St. Lucia, own shares in Lucilec, as well as their shareholders in different countries. In fact, First Citizens Bank in Trinidad owns a significant percentage of Lucilec, as well as I think the National Insurance Board in Trinidad as well would have some shareholding in Lucilec. So it's quite Lucilec has a very wide regional shareholder base. Barbados Light and Power is 100% privately owned. It's owned by Emera. Emera is a Canadian power company. And, this has its implications, whether Barbados Light and Power is more efficient than the others, it's a possibility, who knows. But of course, there comes with there's a cost. Certainly the rates that our friends in Barbados be closer to market pricing than, let's see, what we pay in Trinidad and Tobago. But as I'll show you in a bit, Trinidad and Tobago is a bit of an anomaly where electricity rates are concerned. In Jamaica, the Jamaica Public Service Company is a majority privately owned company. It's 80% owned by Marubeni Corporation and 20% owned by the government of Jamaica. Marubeni, it's Asian-based corporation, headquartered, I think, in Houston, but it is a multinational, and so basically they're responsible for electricity generation in Jamaica. And just by comparison, Jamaica's population is, I think, almost twice the size of Trinidad and Tobago's population. Now, equity, there is a challenge of equity where, the provision of public and quasi-public goods are concerned. And the challenge of equity is, are the costs and benefits paid and enjoyed fairly? Taxation is a means of trying to get a certain level of equity within a system, in that if taxes are, in most countries, taxes are based on income. So in Trinidad and Tobago, the marginal tax rate is 25%. So and of course, there's the first $72,000 of income is not taxed. So people in the lowest income brackets pay no tax, or the minimal tax, and people in the highest income brackets pay more tax in terms of dollar amount or the actual amount of tax. So levying taxes on income is one which will then use to fund public goods, is one way of ensuring some kind of equity. In Trinidad and Tobago, we also have an issue with equality. Now, in addition to taxes generating funds to pay for public goods, in Trinidad and Tobago, we've got a tradition or a history of subsidized quasi-public goods. And usually the subsidies are distributed equally. So everybody gets the same subsidy. All right, so electricity is subsidized, everybody gets the subsidy. It's not a matter of if you are in a lower income and you need it more, you get more of the subsidy. All right, up to recently, education was subsidized through GATE equally across the board. Recently, that was changed and it's been rationalized where GATE has been, the equality from GATE has been removed in favor of equity, where people who deserve or who require more GATE financing would receive more GATE financing, and people whose income level is such that they can pay part of the education would obtain less GATE financing. So, putting the concept of equity and equality in putting it into some concept and looking at some figures, in Trinidad and Tobago, where we have subsidized electricity, look at the rates that the consumer pays compared to some of our neighbors. In Trinidad and Tobago, the cost per kilowatt hour is 35 cents. And I've put all the I've converted everything to TT dollars so we can compare like with like. So a household bill in TT in Trinidad and Tobago of $700. In Jamaica, the same amount of power that costs $700 in Trinidad, that light bill will be $3,980 in Jamaica. All right, we're talking TT dollars here. In Barbados, and Sandra could probably attest to this, in Barbados, what we pay $700 for, they will be paying $3,340 for. All right, and Sandra, just I guess a quick rough and dirty, that's probably equivalent to around 1,100 Bajan dollars. Now, St. Lucia would be paying $4,640 for the same amount of electricity. So does everybody do people in Jamaica, Barbados, and St. Lucia spend a significant chunk of their income on light bills? Or do they use power with a bit more discerning than we do in Trinidad? And I've put a $700 bill as an example. I'm sure a lot of you online are looking at that and saying, but my bill is normally a lot more than 700 because you consume a lot more than 700. All right, this speaks to consumption patterns. And of course, in a situation like this, you find that, again, people who use more enjoy more of the subsidy than people who consume less. So it is skewed towards higher income owners. In fact, the benefit, is skewed towards higher income owners. In Trinidad and Tobago, the auto fuel is also subsidized. So premium gas is $5.75 per liter in Trinidad. It's $8.29 in Jamaica, $12.82 in Barbados, and $7.70 in St. Lucia. So filling up a tank for $253 in Trinidad, right? And I'm just using an economy car, which might take about 45 liters of gas. It takes 253 TT dollars in Trinidad. In Barbados, it would take $365. Sorry, Jamaica would take $365. In Barbados, it would take $564. And St. Lucia, it would take $339. All right, so, and again, in terms of, the subsidies applied equally, everybody enjoys gas at $5.75 per liter, but someone who probably buys a 3-liter, Mercedes-Benz M-Class is going to be using a lot more gas and taking a greater share of the subsidy than someone who's driving a Hyundai Accent. Cooking gas. All right, we're all familiar with these iconic tanks of gas. In Trinidad and Tobago, we pay $21 for a tank of gas. All right, probably $24 if the truck drives around your house and you don't have to go out and get it. In Jamaica, that same little tank of gas costs $106. In Barbados, it costs $112. In St. Lucia, $81. Now, is it that in Jamaica and Barbados and St. Lucia, the private sector the evil private sector is profiteering from people? Not really. This $21 gas actually cost somewhere around $56, $57 to produce. All right, so the government foots the bill for the difference. So this is not an economic price, right? This is a subsidized price that we enjoy because we are citizens of Trinidad and Tobago. Okay, so thank you. That's my presentation for this morning.
Thank you very much, Mr. Falby. Very interesting concepts. We in the field of economics, when you're looking at the market failures, and especially when we lean on the market mechanism to get certain outcomes, and when that does not translate into what we desire, we hope that certain assumptions hold true as we speak to 𝑘𝑶𝑒teris paribus. So I think it will lead very interestingly into the question and answer segment, and I hope you put on your armor, because I know some questions are coming. So thank you very much for that, and we will engage in those discussions. Thank you very much, Mr. Andre Falby. And as we move smoothly along, the next presentation will be delivered directly from Barbados. And it will be delivered by Sister Sandra Messiah. Now, she is the Public Services International, PSI, representative in the Caribbean, working with PSI's 22 affiliates in 20 countries and territories in the English, French, and Dutch-speaking Caribbean. Now, she represents PSI on the Gender Equity Hub, a thematic hub in the Global Health Workforce Network that is co-chaired by Women in Global Health and the WHO, World Health Organization. She is Barbadian by birth, but is better known as a Caribbean trade unionist, having started off her career with the National Union of Public Workers in Barbados, and then moving on to the Commonwealth Trade Union Council, CTUC. And now she sits as the Sub-Regional Secretary for the Caribbean with PSI. Now, Sister Sandra is an alumna of the Commonwealth Study Conference and serves as a member of the Barbados Committee and Steering Committee of the Caribbean Canada Emerging Leaders Dialogue, also known as the CCELD. And it gives me great pleasure to introduce this giant of a woman, this Caribbean trade unionist, who is affectionately known in our circles as Sister Sandra. So I hand the floor over to you so you can deliver in your time. Sister Sandra, it's yours. Excellent. So you can check your microphone and you can begin your introduction. Yes.
Thank you very much.
Welcome.
You figure that by now you know how to unmute yourself. But good morning, everyone. Good morning, Colin, and all my colleagues, friends, sisters, and brothers, and perhaps even some family in Trinidad and Tobago. I found Andre's presentation quite interesting and also a bit worrying in a sense, because he actually made me start looking for bills. I started looking for the natural gas bill and the light and power bill, and I really am going to have to do that little exercise, if not certainly during this time afterwards, to really look at some of the points that he raised in terms of the costs. But today I want to look particularly at public goods from a different perspective than what Andre dealt with. And I really want to get to the nitty gritty and perhaps also to look at it from the point of view of how we see it in Public Services International, together with some of our other colleagues within the wider trade union and social justice movements. A little information on the screen about PSI. You know about us in the Caribbean, but certainly globally as a global trade union federation, we're in 154 countries. We do have status within the United Nations, and therefore are representatives of public services workers in the ILO, in the WHO, and in a whole host of other UN and multilateral agencies. Or certainly our mission is that we're fighting and defending trade union and workers' rights. And of course, we fight for universal access to quality public services. I'm going to try to go through 4 broad areas this morning, looking at some definitions, spending a little bit of time on this thing called the commons. What about all this thing called the commons? Do we really understand in our neck of the woods what we mean by the commons? Looking at public services, and that will include a look at definitions, and also the role of the state. Over the last, I think perhaps 2 or 3 years, I've been fascinated and I've been following, and certainly we in PSI also clearly follow and have actually invited Mariana Mazzucato, a leading, she is described as a leftist economist. But she certainly turns things around. She turns things upside down. And in fact, she delivered the keynote address at the 51st annual meeting of the Caribbean Development Bank last week. But I want to go back to something she said in 2013, 7 years ago, well, just over 7 years ago, about rethinking the state, because I believe that a lot of the discussion regarding this topic of public goods, commodification, and inequalities, social justice issues, actually revolves around views about the state. And I think Andre made some, I'm going to put in brackets, snide references to the state by promoting the what one myth about the efficiencies of the private sector, but we'll leave that for another time. But allow me to read: to foster growth, we must not downsize the state, but rethink it. That means developing, not axing, competencies and dynamism in the public sector. When evaluating its performance, we must rediscover the point of the public sector, and that is to make things happen that would not have happened anyway. In one of her, and I think it was perhaps her, one of her first books, if not the first, Mariana gave a rather detailed account about the entrepreneurial state, educating many people that the things that we take for granted now, like the internet, NASA, space travel, going to the moon, were actually done through public services. In fact, NASA is a public entity. The internet was an offshoot of the development coming out of the space race. So it's important for us to really understand and to pay particular attention to what the state really is. In fact, and I do think that words matter. So I like to say the state as opposed to government. You know how we in the Caribbean like to say, well, the government this and the government that. And in that word or the way in which we pronounce it, government, we mean a whole host of things. We don't only mean the institution of government, but we manage to mix up the parties and politics and who we like and who we vote for and who we don't vote for in that whole thing called government. So I'm going to use the word the state. What has happened particularly with COVID-19 and the way in which we look at or even reconsider public services is that people have turned most of public services during this epidemic. And I would dare say even, well, I don't even know if there's an after COVID. I hesitate to talk about post-COVID. Let's say in the COVID era. So the things that we value, we've come to sit down and think more about: family, health, education, stability, security, and so on. And those are, as we call them, public goods or common goods. The fact that it is the frontline jobs that held things together. And let's be real, they're predominantly held by women. And these are the workers who are often undervalued, underpaid, and in precarious work. And in many cases, particularly when we're talking about the care functions, it's expected that that care function is to be carried out for free. And not to mention the fact that their formal employment rights are often denied. So one of the things that we're saying as Public Services International is that when we're talking about this recovery, and everybody now is into this recovery mode when they should actually have been planning for it before, but the discussion around public care services and gender relations must be at the center of this pandemic recovery, and it must be viewed through an intersectional lens. So we have to consider persons with disabilities. We have to consider those who are in different sexual orientations, persons who are within all the various categories, whether it be different races and ethnicities. I mentioned a minute or so ago that I believe that words matter, but I'd invite you to think about it. Don't they really matter? And what has been happening over the years is that the kind of narrative that we've been having, particularly by those who are the neoliberalists, have actually changed the way in which we understand and view the public service or public services. Words like commons, what is it that's the commons? What is about collectivity and collective life and humanity? And we're actually in a situation amongst ourselves within PSI, and as I said, with our other allies that believe in social justice, we're actually looking at all of these things, the words, the language used, the way certain concepts are developed, the myths that are around. And three things that I think are important for us to think about as we're propelling ourselves towards this recovery. We're in a neoliberal world, and that world is pushing that individual freedom and competitiveness is natural. These things are natural. It's natural to be. I mean, if you recall Andre's talk about the competitiveness of the telecommunications industry, is it that they're really competitive? I think we can have a big debate about that. But at the same time, young people understand the value of solidarity and sharing with others because they are involved in social movements. They do understand these things. So how are these two things in juxtaposition? Individualism to a certain extent, but yet recognizing the value of bringing people together and sharing. But then we also know that not only individuals have to be protected, societies also have to be protected. We're seeing this spate of increased crime of all sorts across the Caribbean, and especially being visible now in our COVID era. And perhaps I'm hesitating whether to call this a cartoon or not, or a caricature of what we're facing, but this is what we're living with. And it happens that we're not only talking about large companies, we're even talking about some of the smaller private sector and even some individuals who are operating in private sector spaces. That regardless of all the other things that are going on, the important thing is profit. So profit takes this front stage, and our message in Public Services International is that it is people over profit. So what are public goods? Many years ago in my micro econ class, we would have had these, standard definitions about non-excludable and non-rivalrous, in the sense that it would be costly or impossible for a private person or private company to provide these public goods. And therefore, one of the aspects of it is that a public good is non-excludable. You can't just keep someone away from, you can't exclude them from benefiting or enjoying that good. The other aspect is that it is non-rivalrous. In other words, it's accessible to all. Someone's usage does not affect the availability to someone else who comes after. And that's the standard definition of public goods. And in discussions with colleagues over the last, I would say, 3-4 months, we've been looking at these definitions and trying to determine, is this really the way it is? Have we really got it? Are there, what are the stories behind this? What's been happening over the years in terms of definitions of public goods, and what are they? And you've got this kind of matrix where you talk about private goods, then there's some commons or common resources, and everybody talks about, they tend to always talk about fish and timber and coal and free public transport. Then they talk about those goods that might be excludable, but they're non-rivalrous. So you can have something that is artificially scarce. So you have a cinema, so you have different fees for people getting into the cinema, or public transport, or a piece of land, which really should be part of the commons, but it's a private golf course. So to keep some people out, they put some fees on them. Amazingly enough, I always say that no matter what they do, certainly people in the Caribbean always find a way to get in, no matter how much it costs. So we do have a saying here in Barbados that if it's too cheap, it isn't good. So something to think about. And then there's public goods. So something like PBS in the US, your local public television stations, TTT, CBC in Barbados, and so on. Your fire service. Andre mentioned national defense. But then there's also this thing about free and open source software, if we're talking about the whole matter of going into technological transformation, basic research, and then herd immunity. Herd immunity is a public good. It's non-excludable and non-rivalrous. Maybe another point to debate. And then there's this thing called the commons. Now, I am wondering if Caribbean public understand or identify with this term called the commons. So these are goods that are non-excludable, but rivalrous. So they're called common resources or the commons. And if I quickly look back, this is where we find our commons in this quadrant. And then you hear this talk about the tragedy of the commons. And it said that this occurs when goods are rival but not excludable. And they usually use an example of fishing and say, well, okay, if the sea is commonly owned, but then what happens is people then will go in and they will fish and fish and fish and fish and deplete all the fish. And then you have a situation of the tragedy of the commons. So when someone cannot be excluded from consuming a good, the group of economists that believe in this and promote this say that then those people have a private incentive to over-consume it. So we're just rabid, savage people that we have no value of family, common, taking care of one another, public interest, nothing like that. That's basically what they're saying. And then there's a new term that we've been exploring, one that's been put forward by a colleague in Europe called the social commons. They're not public goods, but they refer to the common good, what humans share. And therefore, it says that in order to have these social commons, it doesn't exclude the state. It actually does involve the state, but it is collective action and the result of that action. And it is sincerely based on a belief that people can master their present and shape their future within the framework of mutual respect and respect for nature. And that might start to sound familiar. So we're talking about the climate crisis and the way in which people are talking about it, and how they recognize that the profiteers are the ones who are rabid and who have been using up resources all in the name of profit, but that people as people do know how to take stock of things and do want to shape a future where there's mutual respect and respect for nature. So does this in any way apply to the Caribbean or in the Caribbean? Can we identify examples in the Caribbean where this happens? And I think that that is something that we need to be looking at. Then there's the talk about global public goods or digital public goods. So we're now in this age of digital transformation, digitalization. And there's this thing called the digital public good, and there's actually a definition. And it's been defined by the UN Secretary General's Roadmap for Digital Cooperation. And if I may, open source software, open data, open artificial intelligence models, and I have to remember not to say artificial intelligence. Open standards and open content that adhere to privacy and other applicable laws and best practices, do no harm, and help attain the SDGs. So these points that I've raised, and yes, the presentation will be available, and the college will make it available, I believe, to those who request it. These terms, this thinking is one that's occupying our minds, not only within PSI, but certainly within the minds of a number of our colleagues and allies. We have a group that's actually putting together what we're calling a manifesto for public services, exploring the definitions and the themes and the issues related to public goods, public services, government services, and so on. Now, not all goods with positive externalities are public goods. The argument can be made that education is one such good and service, education services and education as a good. So for example, it is said that having invested in education, there's huge spillovers. So it isn't only a situation where it's for the public good, but you do know of instances where education is provided by public companies or private companies or private organizations. And there's this thing about profit that I think we need to deal with in a real way. There seems to be a view that public services don't make profit or can't make profit or shouldn't make profit. I think we have to really dissect that, because public services do need to make a surplus in order to sustain and improve. Workers have to be paid decent salaries and wages. There must be training and constant training, lifelong learning for the workers. And of course, there must be a protection of the environment. So a surplus is needed in order to be reinvested into the services, into the communities, and obviously for the workers. And this is very much different from a situation where profits made by private providers are transferred to private stakeholders, the shareholders in the company. And I'll let that sink in for a bit. So, what is the role of government, or the role of the state, as I prefer to call it? The government is a productive, wealth-creating organization. It supplies direct utilities as well as aids to private production. And the word utilities there is used in the widest sense of infrastructure and the services. And this was said many, many years ago, I think way back in the 1930s by Paul Studenski. Because one thing that I want to emphasize is that what has happened over the years is that the early economists always saw government or the state as a productive entity, not as it is seen now and promoted by many without even recognizing that they're promoting it. But many are now promoting it as this monster, it would seem, that only comes in when things have broken down and okay, so the government gonna fix it, and the government gonna find money for it, and the government gonna provide. And I mean, we've seen it all in this COVID era, where when tourism has fallen, the private sector goes to government. If there's a flood or a storm and agriculture fails, the farmers go to government. If manufacturing falls, the Manufacturers Association comes to government, and so on and so on and so on. And it is as though the more we say it, we make it a life-fulfilling prophecy. But government is a productive, wealth-creating organization. And if you even check within your own country of Trinidad and Tobago, of Trinidad and Tobago, and even countries across the Caribbean, we wouldn't be where we are today in the Caribbean in terms of, if we look at the measurements, the established measurements of prosperity based a lot on our social systems, if it weren't for the productive, wealth-creating organization called government. Because our health, as we keep saying, is our wealth. And in terms of the responses and the experiences in relation to COVID-19 have come about for a number of reasons. One, the kind of work that has been put in based on our susceptibility or vulnerability in the times of various crises, whether it be a hurricane, a storm, volcanic eruption. Those systems were called into play to deal with COVID-19. whether it be dengue, Zika, chikungunya, and so on. The fact that we have our education systems that have allowed for ensuring the ways in which we respond to things. Now, I'm not suggesting that everything is perfect, but what I'm saying is that when you look at other countries, other territories that may be bigger, may have larger budgets, and their response or the ways in which they were able to respond, a lot of it depended on the development of their public services and the way in which their public services were managed. And that includes healthcare. So we do need, I believe, to rethink, turn some of these things upside down in terms of why is it that there's this constant hammering home to us that the state is only there to deal with market failures. It can't produce anything. It's just there to back up the private sector. It's only when things go wrong you call it in. When we have so many examples, not only in terms of the US, Europe, in particular, the ones that we tend to look to in terms of developments, and even within our own countries, we can see examples, because it was the New Deal in the US. It was the whole investment in public services after the war in the UK that helped to build and create wealth in the economies of the United Kingdom and of Europe. Let me know.
Sister Sandra, just checking in, just looking at the time,
Yes,
yes.
I'm going to wrap up in a couple of minutes. Thank you.
Okay, great. Welcome.
Public services. I want to switch now to public services and throw at you, literally, as I said, you'll have an opportunity to look at these things, a number of different definitions. This one on the screen tends to be my favorite, because I think it's one that people can easily look at and sink in with and understand and grasp some rather straightforward language and so on. But then it's also now looking at public services as systems, and to recognize is that there are systems that deliver what the communities identify as common goods, that they're forms of collective provision, that they're systems of production, and a lot of emphasis on the collectivity, that you're sharing and redistributing resources. It's providing equal access for no or little cost at point of access or point of delivery. It's a sort of a mutual help, solidarity, a form of redistribution. And also the linkage with the direct enjoyment of human rights. Some people argue that housing is not a public service, but remember that water, access to food, sanitation, energy, transportation, telecommunications, they're all part of your human rights package. We're talking about vital needs. We're talking about the fact that these services are provided in the common interest, in the public interest, so that they can provide everyone with the access and that they can enjoy them without having to get into rivalry. Another quote from Mariana Mazzucato: by privatizing public goods, outsourcing government functions, and the constant state bashing, government as meddler, at best de-risker, we are inevitably killing the ability of government to think big and make things happen that otherwise would not have happened. So the state starts to lose its capabilities, capacity, knowledge, and expertise. Think about what's happening in your own country, the way in which people continue to bash the state. And therefore, you're having a group of young people who do not want to work for the state. They may go in for a bit and say it's a stepping stone. Without brains, all government will be able to do is not make big things happen, but simply serve a private sector that is concerned only with serving itself. And just to wrap things up about how trade unions play into this, Mariana also talks about the importance of having trade unions. They must be there at the table to provide the workers' voice to frame the transition to a healthier and sustainable post-COVID-19 economy. And finally, sisters and brothers, colleagues, I leave you with a quote from our General Secretary, Rosa Pavanelli. It's time for us, and I'll add in the trade union movement, to be bold and vocal. It's time for us to call on the labor movement and our allies to have a radical agenda. Tomorrow is World Public Service Day, and PSI is committing itself to broaden the area of public services as a vital claim for a more inclusive, prepared, responsive, and resilient society. Sisters and brothers, thank you very much. Looking forward to the discussion.
Sister Sandra, always a pleasure. Such, insightful, deep, and robust contributions. Thank you so much. And I particularly like your end with a call to action. And as we go into the discussion, I was very interested, and I will be very interested to hear about those social commons. So thank you. And I know you also challenge Mr. Falby. So Andre, I know you are also looking forward. But as we look forward, up next, we have Dr. 𝘑𝘶𝘦𝘴𝘥𝘢𝘺 Jaffa, and she is from Albania and is currently stationed at the University of Kassel in Germany. And she's the executive director of the online academy at the Global Labor University. So adding to the discussion on the panel this morning, we have Dr. 𝘑𝘶𝘦𝘴𝘥𝘢𝘺 Jaffa, and she has a master's in labor policies and globalization from the GLU in Germany and holds a PhD in labor studies from the University of Milan in Italy. Now, since 2000, she has been engaged with national trade unions in her own country, Albania, as well as in the Philippines, Bangladesh, Cambodia, and Myanmar. Now, she has worked for and collaborated with a number of international trade unions and labor organizations, such as the Education International, Building and Woodworkers International, Public Services International, and with other labor organizations, such as the ILO and the Friedrich Ebert Foundation. Now, areas of research include collective bargaining, workers' rights, right to strike, collective forms of representation, and action of precarious workers and workers in informal employment. She also looks at trade union strategies against inequality, alternative forms of organizing the economy, and public services, among others. Now, it's really right that I give justice to Dr. 𝘑𝘶𝘦𝘴𝘥𝘢𝘺 Jaffa as she prepares to add to this discussion here this morning and really deliver her engaging presentation. So from Europe, I know we're in the Euro season, and we look to really mix up the contributions here this morning. I turn the floor over to Dr. Jaffa 𝘑𝘶𝘦𝘴𝘥𝘢𝘺. The floor is yours.
Yeah, good morning, comrades, and thank you very much, really, for the invitation to be part of this very important conversation. I'm really glad to join this panel. As Colin introduced me, I'm going to focus really on what has been my work more generally about alternatives beyond capitalism, and in this respect, really looking at the public services, and in particular, really looking at the public partnerships, which are, can you see my screen, my PowerPoint?
Yes, we are.
That's great. So really looking at the case of public-public partnerships, and it kind of follows in the research we've been doing for a long time, in which we look at the alternatives by actually analyzing current stories of resistance and struggles. And I'm going to talk about such struggles, particularly public-public partnerships, and just to reiterate that it is not the public-private partnerships that Andres spoke in the beginning. It's not the PPPs, but we're looking really at an alternative to the PPPs and to privatization, which is public-public partnerships, or PUPs. We come actually from the assumption that the current resistance and struggles to the commercialization of public services and privatization and PPPs are at the same time experiments with new, provide at the same time some sort of experiments with new forms of public services. So in a way, we're trying to anchor visions of public services on these current struggles by considering these spaces for transformative resistance as spaces of also articulating new visions of public services, because indeed they do provide sometimes practical, but sometimes also theoretical visions of public services, and new language indeed, as Sandra also mentioned in her presentation. And this new and alternative kind of articulations are very different actually from the status quo of public services. So these different struggles provide, in a way, a critique of privatization, but also a critique of traditional public services, in which in many countries, public is actually equalized with state forms of ownership. Sometimes they're limited to subsets of population, to full citizens, particularly in the global south. They're often bureaucratic and hierarchical. At times, they are identified as inefficient and corrupted, and hardly designed to actually realize the creativity of labor in the process of delivering services to their fellow citizens. So in a way, these different struggles across the world help to overcome the state versus privatized public services debate. And they help actually to build on, but also bridge the northern past of public services with southern future models of participatory democracy that became particularly, manifested in Latin America during a certain historical period. And I'll go a bit deeper into some of the reasons for the backslide of these initiatives. Just going to the public services and trying to find some sort of a definition so we can get along together. They have actually risen as an alternative to privatization, but also to failed state operators, or to create limitations in the way the public services, that state-owned public services have been delivered. What is important for us to highlight here, that the public-public partnership exclude any partnership with the private sector. So that's very important to remember. And these are all definitions coming from the Public Services International Research Unit, PSIRU, under the leadership, particularly during the leadership of David Hall, who did extensive work on public-public partnerships. And their team characterized and provide two main definitions of PUPs. One is the narrow partnerships, and that is exclusively between the public utilities, or different types of public utilities, different levels, and even different countries. And we are going to call this the twinning PUPs for our discussion. And the broader partnership, public utilities and any part of the general public, that includes trade unions, NGOs, civil society, community-based organizations, but also organizations across borders. And we call this, for the purpose of our analysis, participatory PUPs. But of course, while, different forms of resistance may classify as an alternative, we need to kind of really provide some sort of a screening tool to evaluate what does really constitute some sort of an alternative or an expression of an alternative in the making. And here I am working in particular with the concept of publicness, which is developed by the municipality project under David McDonald and his colleagues, which provide really some indicators for us to understand, to really have a solid concept of what does it mean public and what does it constitute publicness. And that being said, there is an understanding and a realization that despite pressure of commercialization, there has been a perseverance of element of publicness in public services. It is also, they are also offering a possibility to operationalize this concept by providing a set of indicators, and that includes equity, participation, efficiency, quality of service, accountability, transparency, quality of workplace, sustainability, solidarity, public ethos, and transferability. So they have a very comprehensive manual actually on trying to provide a detailed description of this concept and its indicators. But the main idea is that these indicators are somehow the polar opposites of what's wrong actually with privatization, and at the same time the kind of aim to gear the public services towards completing universal societal objectives such as democracy, environmental sustainability, and human security. I want to just go through quickly some of the main indicators because it will be important for the analysis of the PUBs that we want to see, and also to unpack some sort of indicators that come from, you know, mainstream international organizations and from the government, such as efficiency, for instance, and particularly private sector efficiency that is being put forward, you know, vis-a-vis the public sector efficiency. And it is important here to highlight how this term is actually rather neutral, technical, and opaque. And what for us it is important to unpack here is to really understand that it's really a narrow framing, that it has no regard on the impact of these efficiency gains on other sectors and on society. Just to give you a few examples here, for instance, part of efficiency is to reduce the number of workers per connection. I think the World Bank guideline is 2 to 3 workers per 1,000 connections, which means you automatically cut off you know, public sector jobs, quality public sector jobs, and you actually intensify the work for the existing staff. Or for instance, they talk about cost effectiveness, and that includes introducing or increasing the fees on access to services. And clearly such concept of efficiency fails to address the societal goals of quality of life and dignity, because it is very narrowly focused really on this efficiency in terms of financial efficiency. Instead, what the team is proposing, that is working on the indicators, is the social efficiency, which includes different components: the financial efficiency of delivering services, resource efficiency, you know, losses and administration costs and so on, level of investment to ensure long-term maintenance, and then very important, the impact of efficiency gains on other sectors, workers, affordability, environment, health and safety, and quality. So I think for us, particularly for the Trinidad and Tobago context, it's really important in kind of facing the challenge and the discourse of privatization of public sector services such as water, for instance, is to really unpack these different concepts that are being put forward as if it's the final truth. And the same goes for some other important indicators. For instance, on issues of equity, it's very important to consider issues of accessibility in terms of class, location, gender, ethnicity, reliability, you know, issues of power and water shortage. And of course, here it is important to remember that countries may deal with issues of equity in different ways. And I think André showed that nice cartoon in one of his slides about different way how the countries try to pursue objectives of equity, if they do pursue such as vertical equity by distributing of resources according to the needs, or horizontal equity, basic minimum package of benefits to all people. Then when it comes to the quality, of course, this becomes a bit more complex because it is indeed shaped by both cultural perceptions and market pressure. For instance, we are bombarded in the media and everywhere that bottled water is better than tap water. And it's just the way how the market has been working and in actually convincing people that that's what's quality water, what you find in the bottle. So try to reshape the quality aspect and finding indicators for this one. It's pretty challenging, but some suggestions have been to use acceptability by users as well as observances of improved quality. And I come to perhaps the most important indicator when it comes to particularly our topic, public partnerships, which is participation and accountability indicators, because it is really important to overcome, you know, the approach of bureaucrats deciding what is actually best for the citizens. And that's really important for us to understand why we should insist on the participation of community and workers. It really enhances transparency and accountability. It empowers users. It provides additional technical and political capacities in the sector. It does strengthen those capacities. It creates a sense of ownership among citizens. And it's important to highlight here that the depth of participation is very important, because the depth of participation determines the impact on achieving the publicness kind of a vision of public services. You know, researchers have put forward different forms of participation, and White have put these 4 categories: nominal, instrumental, representative, and transformative, just to highlight different ways how communities and workers can be involved, sometimes in a very instrumental way, and sometimes as a token kind of participation, and ranging up to what we call transformative participation, which basically it's the empowering type of participation, because the very involvement of workers and communities in considering options and making decisions and taking collective action is actually an important, it's an empowering exercise that allows communities then to build really greater consciousness about what are the problems and the causes of their poverty, as well as confidence in the ability to make a difference to address these very causes. And then we've seen here that despite the fact that the literature and participation, you know, is kind of very much focused on communities and NGOs and different groups, workers have kind of been left aside. And that's for 2 reasons. One is that indeed, even the progressive kind of scholars and so on have somehow internalized that discourse that came particularly from the World Bank, that the reason for the poor quality of public service is actually public sector workers. At the same time, often public sector workers have been so much focused only on jobs and you know, terms of employment, and have been really looking much less. And we're not talking about the last few decades, but traditionally the focus has been more on the workplace. And what we have seen in, I think, the struggles of the last decade has been particularly these transitions of struggles, not only from just fighting privatization and engaging with issues of ownership, but really moving to issues of control over the purpose of labor in public services. What does it mean to be a public sector worker? You know, to be allowed to actually express your, to give the service and express your feeling to your fellow citizens in serving them in the process. And then the last one is sustainability indicator that I wanted to highlight. Of course, the 2 important one here are financial stability, and you mentioned the 2 previous speakers also mentioned the importance of financial sustainability, which is important, but just here to highlight that public services are not in to make profit. That's not their major purpose. The major purpose is to serve public. And I think that's an important consideration in discussing financial sustainability and, of course, environmental sustainability, you know, all issues about nature and intensity of using resources. I mean, let's not forget, in some cases, public services are some of the major polluters by the way in which they are organized. And these are all issues that have to be taken up in analyzing the necessary transformations that have to happen in the public sector. But I want to stop shortly to the political sustainability, because I think it's particularly critical. We've seen really very critical initiatives, very powerful initiatives, backsliding. And that's because, you know, the political sustainability of initiatives and experiments is particularly important given the context of a neoliberal, I'm not saying hegemony, but really a domination of such a discourse. And that political support for these initiatives at various levels is really critical, not only because these are new initiatives, but indeed they are under strong attack from different actors that actually you know, are interested in making profit out of the public services. And here we are talking of the importance of a strong and supportive state. And here what we mean is not a domineering state, and a state that acts with society and not in replacement of it. And that's kind of the transformation of the state that we are looking at. And there is really a need for what this somehow the backsliding of different initiatives have shown us has been the importance of having a robust system to resist this broader context of neoliberal policies. And that only highlights the importance of transforming institutional structures, and that would be about dismantling old forms of the state with a much broader set of actors and innovative forms of governance, organizing public services to build broader-based solidarity across different actors, sectors, and various levels of services, and new and broader policy capacities and sources of finances. Indeed, to support these new initiatives, particularly because you don't want to be dependent on donors who often may have conflicting objectives actually from the objectives of public services. And these are all important. We'll see how they play out in some of the examples of public partnerships that I want to share with you. So let's look at the twinning PUBs. And I've just picked up a few examples because the time is very limited. I think I have about 10 more minutes. So we have the example of the Harrismith municipality and Rand Water Company in South Africa. It had remarkable improvements in cost recovery. So just to recall, the twinning partnerships are those in between two public utilities exclusively. So it did have remarkable improvements in cost recovery, but it did that on the back of cutting off thousands of people for non-payment. Another partnership in Malawi with the UK water facility in this case, it led to improvement in water and sanitation services, but there was no worker involvement. In fact, workers were even dismissed for demanding higher wages and for challenging, you know, practices of financial mismanagement. We have another partnership, the Baltic Sea partnerships. It brought together countries from the Baltic, Sweden, Finland, and also Lithuania, Estonia, and Latvia. And in particular, the Tallinn Water Utility and Helsinki Water Partnership. It did strengthen the capacities of water utilities, but it also led to corporatization, which in a way paved the way for privatization and led eventually to job cuts and price increases, enormous dividend payments, and remuneration of supervisory council. So just to wrap up, when you put this partnership in the publicness framework, so we're trying to test this kind of experiments vis-a-vis the publicness framework and the indicators that I just introduced, we see that, of course, they do contribute. They improve water infrastructure and service delivery at a much lower cost, actually, than PPPs. They develop capacity for workers and their capacities, which in a way reduces the dependency on external consultants. They help public utilities to access finance, enhance financial efficiency, and improve quality. but they also have limitations, particularly in terms of participation, accountability, sustainability, and social efficiency, which shows that actually, really reforming public services and transforming public services is not merely an issue of capacities, because all what these partnerships did was actually just to build the capacities of workers, but it is fundamentally a political issue. And here we want to stop to the critical role of workers and communities participation and jump now to some examples of participatory public partnerships. I just brought 4 such partnerships. So one, and I also want to draw a bit of attention to the language that these partnerships use. So in the case of Bolivia and Honduras, they are called public collective partnerships. And then you have water utility and water committees and other community-based bodies were able to actually work together to expand access to water in Bolivia. And then they provided training and assistance to improve water conservation and service delivery in Honduras. In another context in Bolivia, where it was where there were massive protests against water concessions, we have the emergence of what they call public social companies. And here you have yet another kind of language that is emerging from the local context. And we have a coalition of 600 neighborhoods that came together, in a common front called FEJUVE. And ask for full transparency and bottom-up decision-making through people's participation. They also pushed for a general assembly responsible for overall policies and election of the company boards. They also set up a control and monitoring commission to really make sure that there was collective control and corruption-free operation of public services. Another interesting example comes from Uruguay, of course, with a long history of struggle for democracy. And then here again, we have a context of environmentally damaging water waste plants and privatization plans of the government. And here we have a national water movement of bringing together trade unions, environmental and human rights NGOs, and pushing actually for a constitutional reform which included stipulations about human rights to water, direct public control, participation of citizens in all areas and steps of management, and an ecosystem approach. So we have here also the environmental aspect included. They also organized several assemblies of workers and citizens to draft this utility reform. So it wasn't done by some experts outside there. It wasn't even done from some representatives of trade unions and communities. Actually, you had several assemblies of people debating how should the reform actually be transformed. And then the union took this example to actually push for promotion of PAPs among non-commercialized utilities in the region. I will stop a bit longer to the case of Peru because it seems to be a bit more similar with the Trinidad context about what's happening with regard to the water sector. And here we have really the case of a bottom-up PAPs. The National Union of Water Workers and its local affiliate and the range of other social movements again came together in a common front, protecting water in the region of Union. It was a multi-pronged strategy. At the national level, the block legislation that promoted the liberalization and commercialization of water services. At the same time, they created broad alliances with social movements to build defensive fronts for water and to create alternative models for modernizing without privatizing. They also worked with different national and international organizations, including the PSI, to really create a common common knowledge base about the problems of the water utility. Really, they had a detailed diagnosis of the utility and how to fight the corruption, as well as options for modernizing and democratizing the utility. And in this case, they called it public participatory utility. I'm just taking this because it shows that in different countries, you have different articulations of how these are called, and they are expressions actually of how people on the ground feel, of what is their vision of how the utility should be run. when these plans kind of got blocked due to the local politics, they pushed for a partnership with a worker-run utility in Argentina and created detailed plans to reduce costs, improve maintenance, increase investment, orient service delivery to people's needs, and make the utility more democratic and accountable. And if we put now the participatory PAPs in the publicness framework, we can clearly see that it really goes beyond capacity building and knowledge and skill sharing. It creates a greater sense of ownership of services, greater accountability of managers and politicians, an improved responsiveness to community and labor needs. It overcomes resistance to reforms, where often workers are blamed for resisting the different reforms, but that's exactly because they are pushed out of any sort of participation from the discussions about such reforms. And it is when the reforms are undertaken really with the active and deep participation of workers that you have a completely different situation. It did also strengthen the leadership, planning and coordination in service provision, and it built greater trust in between all the different actors, communities, workers, local politicians, and so on. And that was perhaps the most important element of this one, is really the extent of inclusion of community voice and priorities in the decision making. And it is really important, the insistence on this participation is particularly important because of the critical feedback that they provide. And it's due to this critical feedback that is provided that this public-public partnership can really contribute to higher quality of service, higher access, because workers and communities themselves can actually see what are the bottlenecks when it comes to quality and access, and shape social efficiency gains and greater transparency and accountability. And it does really contribute to sustainability. And the reason for that is particularly because as, let's say, environmental concerns are brought in from the communities, workers have the knowledge and expertise to address these environmental concerns of communities. The partnerships also help to build the whole process helps to build these partnerships in the operation of utilities. So in some cases, and I'll come to that a bit later, you really had even the establishment of particular structures which ensure continuous participation of workers and community. And indeed, finally, the depth of participation of workers and communities can determine the level to which democracy is actually embedded in the internal administration of the utility, which is directly related to the political sustainability. The problem I mentioned earlier, that once the political forces change, several of these initiatives have actually backslided, exactly because a main reason being really the depth of participation of workers and communities. And finally, just to highlight that although, there's different forms of partnerships, we don't have really an in-depth analysis, done particularly for analyzing and exploring and discovering this alternative ways of public services. They do provide some insights of actually the importance of such initiatives in informing the new ways of organizing public services, because indeed they empower workers and communities to imagine and articulate new visions of public services, more people-focused, community-responsive, and publicly accountable organizations. At the same time, as I mentioned a bit earlier, they lead to the establishment of new structures and processes which lead actually to critical changes in the way the public services are organized. For instance, we have cases of, particularly in the participatory budgeting schemes in Latin America, but also in India, you had budget allocations by community, social control and transparency of public utility. We have institutionalization of the participation of workers and communities, and as well setting in motion processes of collective learning, spaces for actually producing counter knowledge and counter power to the dominant discourse. The quality of participation determines at the end the ability to alter actually the structures and institutions that lead to the marginalization and exclusion of communities. And they also provide workers with the ability to politicize and expand issues of access to public services. So once you start with the public partnership in the health sector, you realize and you go to broader social determinants of health, that being water, housing, food, nutrition, and access to electricity and so on. So it's exactly the participation in communities that allows for expansion of that agenda. And for such initiatives to actually be able to survive and flourish, it is really important that they are turned really into political projects. And that's the only way how they might actually survive, by setting in motion, there's different changes in the way public services are organized, but also work in the public sector is organized. So thanks a lot. I think I'll leave it there.
Great,
within time.
Great, no, great. Thank you very much. Well done. And this is really one of the points of these discussions, that we really need a week. The Cipriani College has given us a week for weeks, but just this morning we have this limited time to discuss. So Dr. Elma Jaffa, thank you so much. Really interesting discussion on the POPs. Whether we twinning it or we participating. And we will have questions coming. Particularly interesting to me was, in terms of the transforming of the institutions and, the way you go about that. So I know we would have those questions coming on, and the questions have been coming. I encourage you all to continue to direct your questions through the YouTube chat, and we will get into the discussion now. Now, we had a bit of a late start, so we'll be going to 11:30 in order to give justice to this discussion. So I'm really hoping that everyone, especially you, Dr. Jaffa, I know you said it's well into the evening time at your location. So, I think the discussion should keep you on your toes and, on your feet. So we get into the discussion, and some questions have been coming through. Now, I will show the questions from presenter to presenter, and you can feel free to respond, and if any other presenter can also chime in. So we go to Andre first of all, and your discussion really, I think, as we say in local parlance, you stuck the Japanese a bit. So of course, we have some questions coming up, particularly around looking at your comparison in terms of the pricing of the commodities, particularly from territory to territory in the Caribbean. Now, in terms of that, and this would be my first question with a follow-up after, looking at the situation in terms of, you speak to equality and equity, can you also touch on in terms of the average salaries and standards of living as it applies in these territories? Because we're looking at the public goods, but also the concept of inequality. So how impactful, have those interventions been in terms of maintaining or I should say limiting the inequality, particularly as they look to deal with these market failures, in terms of the standards of living and how that would apply?
Mm-hmm.
All right, and well, you could respond to that, and I can follow up. Yes.
Okay, sure. First of all, in terms of standard of living, I think the standard of living in Trinidad and Tobago is, I would say, is comparable to the rest of the Caribbean. In fact, if we were to be realistic, it is probably a bit higher in terms of purchasing power parity. Now, the whole point of showing the comparisons in terms of what we pay here versus the other places is not necessary to argue that privatization is better, or by no means. What it shows is that because we have subsidized prices on some of these quasi-public goods, there is a misconception that the goods are cheap, and there is a tendency to probably waste or overconsume some of these goods. In the other regions, there's more cautious using of some of these goods. And, you know, Sandra made a point about governments creating wealth. The state does have a responsibility to create wealth, and states across the world has proven that it can create wealth. There are several examples in Trinidad where the state has created wealth by investing in areas where the private sector simply did not want to take the risk. You know, I could just look at the Hyatt, for example, just one example. All right, there are several others. But when you have a case where a subsidy is given to make a product more affordable, but then it's given equally across the board, you know, someone who has a 10-bedroom house, you know, consuming, you know, 10 times the electricity of someone with a basic 3-bedroom house, they're using more than their fair share of a quasi-public good, and they're not paying their fair share for it. The taxpayer is really paying for it. So that's kind of my point about finding some balance within a pricing structure.
Excellent. And you know, that segues great into a follow-up question, because it was actually on that. Because you speak to the subsidized quasi-public good. And in terms of the management of that type of economy, how, I mean, Trinidad and Tobago is an oily rich or mineral rich economy. And let's look at the equity when it comes to how people really contribute to and benefit from the provision of those sorts of goods. And I want to put Sister Sandra on notice, because I come into the digital public good, especially within that framework. But before we go to Sister Sandra, Andre, just in terms of you know, balancing that yardstick in terms of the contribution to and the benefit from the you know, the quasi-public good, as you put it. Yes. Okay,
well, first of all, the oil and gas revenue is the way that the state has managed to successfully subsidize so many goods in Trinidad and Tobago. But if we don't recognize that oil and gas is it's a commodity that is not going to be around forever. I mean, this is like, you know, someone with rich parents, and the parents decide that they're going to maintain children well into their 20s and 30s, but the parents aren't going to be around forever. All right. And if the parents' source of wealth is, let's say, employment income, and you know, you bring up children that, okay, we'll subsidize your lifestyle, we look after you all into your 30s. But at some stage, the parents might hit their 70s and can no longer afford to maintain adult children in their 40s. But if the children haven't learned to you know, stand on their feet economically, then it's going to be a problem. And that's kind of what's happening with us right now. Oil and gas is not going to be around. We have to forever, you know, we have to find other ways to stand on our feet.
All right, fantastic. Thank you, Andre. And you go to Sister Sandra, and from her posture, I know she has some she probably has some desire to respond to some of those questions posed earlier, but I will let you begin by segueing into the public good contribution, and as far as, because a lot of persons have been asking about this digital public good, and within the context of the current economic climate and global climate, especially with coronavirus and COVID-19, that digital public good, in terms of the framework and the ecosystem for it. One, in terms of expanding on the component, and then the question I have with that is in terms of the mindset. Is the mindset currently available to roll out and truly benefit from the concept of a digital public good, Sister Sandra?
Okay,
Yes.
a rather complex
Yes.
issue. Let me start by noting that this is an area, digitalization, and particularly from the perspective of public services unions and public services workers, is a big
Excellent.
project for us in PSI now. And in fact, Brother Atkins is involved in one of our training sessions on digital rights organizers. The whole matter of digital public goods, and if I can just repeat for everyone's benefit, a digital public good. So it includes open source software, open data, open AI models, open standards, open content, and things like that, best practices, applicable laws. And the applicable laws, I think, is where perhaps a lot more work needs to be done, certainly within Trinidad and Tobago. I believe you have a Data Protection Act. I'm not sure of the exact title, but I think it is sometime back from in 2013, which is before the GDPR, the Global Data Protection Rights as developed through the European Union. Now, certainly that law that is in Trinidad needs to be really looked at in the context of the GDPR, and perhaps also to look at what are the two most up-to-date digital laws in the Caribbean, that of Jamaica and Barbados, which are between highly to somewhat aligned to the GDPR. But I also want to bring up an issue about how we think about data. We spend a lot of time talking about the privacy aspect, but your data is your data. It belongs to you. That's not a fundamental issue in this whole thing. It is how that data is used, how it is collected, and even more important, to whom does it belong? Our premise as PSI, and along with our partners, in particular IT for Change, is that that data must belong to the country, and that governments must have a role in regulating the use of that data. So, for example, many children are now using Google Classroom or Moodle or all the other things, but I think those are the two most common ones. So Google knows almost everything there is to know about children in Trinidad and Tobago, Barbados, all the islands and territories in the Caribbean. They will use that data to create intelligence. And they may even then, because you don't have the necessary laws and standards in place, want to sell it back to the government in the absence of the respective laws to protect the ownership, that collectivity of data. So that's where the public good comes in, and the public good of digital. The collectivity of that data, the intelligence created by that data, to whom does it belong? Have we been thinking about it? Another example, the one common way, and it's done through our telecommunications companies, they give a smartphone to some young people. They tell them go all the way, go through Diego Martin, go in Arima, walk around, and then they have the ability to know all the different roads and tracks and shortcuts and so on. Now, when that data is collected, the intelligence from that data would actually be useful to governments in terms of identifying, as they currently do through the census, but even it would be richer, the intelligence about where to put a roundabout or street light, where to build schools. When you have an appointment that you put in your Google Calendar, your phone tells you, okay, if you leave now, you'll get there in 10 minutes. All of that, who owns that? And is it that Google is going to sell that to you through your government? Will your government then have to pay? What were the deals struck in order to deal with that in terms of not only the collection and the saving of that data, but the creation of the intelligence from all that data. So the matter of digital public goods, I think, has to start with educating certainly some important people within your policymaking departments, whether it be through the telecommunications and through the I think you have the Telecommunications Union office in Trinidad and Tobago, if I'm not mistaken. You also have to be developing this knowledge with your trade unions, because there are going to be rights issues associated with this. So my response to the question, which may not be pointedly as it was worded, but perhaps some recommendations, is that this is an area that your trade union movement, certainly in terms of the legal profession, and certainly in terms of the staffing within the various government departments. And I can't pick out any one and say that is the one. It has to be done right throughout the public service about digital rights, ownership of the data, and even the storage of the data, because the cloud is not really a cloud. The cloud is located in certain markets. And is it that we need to have our own cloud for Caribbean data? Or what is it that we're going to do? And in terms of updating and ensuring that our legislation not only is in keeping with GDPR, but also that we are using the clauses within the GDPR to protect workers and people's rights, as well as, I'm going to emphasize this one, ensuring that you make sure the public really understands how this data is dealt with. And this is perhaps a really good opening for work that the Cipriani College, for example, can get involved with. So a lot of background work to be done, a lot of advocacy starting now.
Excellent. And I just want to follow up something as a segue into Ed-Lyra's presentation. You raised some critical points there. And in terms of, and against a reality, it may be a perception that private sector tends to be a more efficient enterprise. You know, you speak to the collection of data, you speak to, you know, the operations, especially within the digital hemisphere. And in terms of now the public, in terms of those public enterprises and the public services now attempting to capture information and data and other resources that may reside within the public, within the private enterprise. In terms of that perception, and especially as you come from Public Services International and PSI, which you represent, and you have a lot of statements in terms of that. Let's speak to that efficiency and put it against each other, compare and contrast, you know, that efficiency, or whether it be perceived or real, of the private sector as opposed to the public sector. And that's segueing into something Ed-Lyra presented on in terms of hop-ups. And I'll ask her the question following your response.
Well, I mean, that's a very general statement, so I can't give an answer, but I have really no real evidence about efficiency. Well, efficiency, if we want to deal with the definition of efficiency, they're more streamlined. Things are not necessarily across a whole range of services and so on. But is it that people want things to be efficient, or is it that they want them to be effective? You can always buy efficiency, and you can always buy the, oh there, this might sound bad, but I'm gonna say it nevertheless. You can always buy the researcher to say that your system is efficient. We get into this battle, and I'm not so sure that we are in the right place to be able to do it. The public services always come under high scrutiny. We don't have the same high scrutiny with private companies. Andre mentioned about Emera Caribbean Inc., 100% owned in Barbados. They still continue with the name Barbados Light and Power, which was always private owned. It's over 100 years old here. They had enough money that they could buy themselves. So they're no longer listed on the stock exchange, so we can't scrutinize anything. We don't know. They made so much money, but yet still laid off people. So it's that kind of thing. So we can't scrutinize private sector in the way in which we scrutinize the public sector. If we see somebody that we know working at tech, depending on how they dress or what car they buy, we have everything to say. But if it is someone else in a private company, so-called private company, well, them as work for the big bucks. But we don't have the same kind of criteria to judge. So I don't have any kind of proof. In fact, I have proof to the opposite, because I see all sorts of strange things happening in the private sector. That when we go in, we keep quiet. We ain't saying a word. We go in the bank for our money, we wait long, and everybody quiet.
Excellent, excellent.
So I think that needs to be put on the table.
I fully, I receive that. It is well received, because, a lot of times that you speak to, it's a case of comparing apples with oranges, and, really not putting it within the, that framework for correct comparison. But in terms of the comparison, we can now turn to 𝘑𝘶𝘶 and direct some questions based on her presentation, because she really compared public to public, and I love the term, the very endearing term POPs, and those participated and those twinning. And the discussion really is in terms of 𝘑𝘶𝘶, I particularly appreciated in terms of the twinning POPs. Now, and I know you provided some very cogent examples of that. In terms of the twinning POPs and the opportunities for POPs, have you, in your experience, your research, been able to identify this being a growing trend?
No, I mean, perhaps I had to say from the beginning that actually what I did was I was just reviewing literature.
Right.
So in a way, the analyses are also conditioned by what has been offered in terms of the operation of these different forms of PAPs from the literature. So of course I would have had other questions, had I done the research myself and looked at these partnerships. But I think the main, they were definitely very popular during the time that I did this research, and particularly in the water service, very, very much spread in the water service. But I think the important thing to remember here that whereas they were actually quite effective in providing training, capacity building for workers, technical capacity, they really scored much more in terms of participation. And in a way, it is much more difficult to sustain this twinning PAPs over time, exactly because that meaningful participation of workers and communities is actually lacking in such partnerships. And as I showed, there were quite a few examples in which the effects have been in fact negative. In some cases, the workers being dismissed, or it definitely didn't lead to more democratization, sometimes paved way for commercialization and eventually privatization. So, I think if PAPs are going to be some sort of a model to look at, and what I mean by model, I by no means mean calling them PAPs, as I try to actually show they are called in different ways in different countries. So the communities determine what is their own vision of how the public service of water or energy or health sector should be looking like. And I think with the focus of my research over the last years has been particularly exploring existing current struggles and trying to get the inspiration from those struggles rather than offering top-down visions that would eventually inspire people, but really trying to anchor our visions in these current struggles and the potential they have to actually transform public services. And I don't think I can emphasize this sufficiently. Really transforming work in the public sector, that workers in the public sector are currently in many public sector utilities are not very far from what workers in the private sector would kind of experience in terms of the managerial style, the bureaucratic one, the one in which workers' knowledge and feelings are actually left outside, and their expertise is only, you know, asked in certain occasions when there is a crisis, but it's not done in a more permanent way. And I think that's kind of where the participatory PAPs, particularly those in which you have deep and transformative participation, really hold the greatest promise in terms of transforming the public services and work in the public sector.
Excellent. And just as a follow-up too, I particularly also was interested in the twinning POPs and the publicness, that quote-unquote publicness framework. And you know, one of the things I saw you emphasize was the critical role of the workers and the communities. And you know, I think it's a good place to segue into that, workers and communities participation. And you know, how that offers, as you say, it's a critical role, but how it is more or less a requirement really for the success of any such model. I mean, we are Cipriani College of Labor and Cooperative Studies. The collective bloodline runs through our veins. So in terms of that collective and participatory role of workers and communities, in terms of enhancing and building that publicness framework, you know, we could shed some light and provide context into that.
Yeah, I mean, just to say, participation, it's quite a time-intensive exercise. And we have to understand that it kind of challenges the whole way how work is organized. Because if most of people in our communities are working 8 to 10 hours, and if then they are required to actually participate in meetings, in which they don't even understand the language because sometimes it's technical. So there are so many challenges to participation, and it is not by accident that it is difficult to actually push for this kind of partnerships, because indeed it is quite an engaging exercise, time-consuming, energy-consuming, and it may even, you know, show and display the disparities and inequalities within the communities themselves. Some groups being much more vocal, having more resources to participate. You know, women perhaps often not having the possibility to actually participate meaningfully, or certain ethnic groups and so on. So if we are to take participation seriously, you will need somehow a full transformation of the whole society. Like, why should we work 8 hours per day and then 5 days a week? And why not, you know, shorten the working time to work longer, to participate more in political activities, in community activities, and so on? How do you address all the different challenges and barriers to participation in the community, knowing of the inequalities that exist in our communities? And most importantly, how do trade union organizations become spaces for democracy? It is very hard to really argue for participation of workers in all the processes of organizing work and having control over the labor process if the union itself is not an example of that democracy in terms of how the agendas are set, how the priorities are put up, how the decisions are taken with the participation of the members and so on. So everything is really connected. We talk about how important that participation is and what is the potential, but we understand that a meaningful participation in public services, it definitely has spillover effects, and it should be underpinned by all these different changes that have to happen in the workplace, in the communities, in our trade union organizations, and in other political organizations.
Oh, wow. If ever there was an excellent response, thanks. You know, in because it's so imperative. And I mean, you know, we are touching on these issues. And I like the emphasis on that participation in order to get it. And yet I reference also to trade union organizations and those kind of collective organizations in terms of harnessing concepts such as democracy. And I want to go to Sister Sandra because she spoke to something that is the social common good. And you know, and that's right before I go to Andrew, because you know we come into something on terms of state capitalism. But before we get there, we're looking at the social common good. And Sister Sandra, you spoke to the commons, and then you open up the discussion in terms of the social common good. And in terms of that participation, let's look at the commons and let's look at the social common good and let's look at the structures that reside there. What would be your call to action around the social common good, and you know, and positioning it for us to pivot into reducing inequality and really benefiting the public as a whole?
Couple of things buzzing around in my head here, but if I can kind of lift off a bit from 𝘑𝘶𝘦𝘴𝘥𝘢𝘺. I think the whole matter of participation has to be perhaps explained. Sounds trite, I guess. But I think we have a situation where even within our unions, we view participation at a particular time and not necessarily as part of the language nowadays is the ecosystem of our unions. So
Please
participation must be right through. I mean, I guess it's the same way we do it in our countries where we view that democracy means voting in the election, or that we have what are called free and fair elections and that we vote, and that's participation. I think if we're talking about a social commons, it means, and if, for example, the trade union movement is to be pushing this, it also has to practice it. It also has to learn what it is. In our societies in the Caribbean, where we all grew up, and I think most of you may be in the same age group, and to a certain extent, it continues right through. We were told that the way to assure our freedom or independence, even our wealth, was through education. But what kind of education are we really involved in now? Is it education to have, you know, something else to hang up on the wall? Or is it really education in its true sense, where it provides us with the opportunity to think things through, to debate, and together we come up with possible solutions? The other aspect to this, so I've mentioned two things. One, it's in terms of the trade union movement and its role, both within itself and in its relationship with society. Secondly, the role of education, well, I should say education and training, in the way not only it's delivered, but what is delivered. And thirdly, I'm wondering if, in terms of looking at those natural allies, we start, because I think in Trinidad and Tobago, if I get sometimes confused with certain countries, but you do have a lot of groups, community groups within the various districts and communities. How are they structured? How do they work? How do they see themselves in terms of the governance of the country? And are they seeing themselves contributing to that in a meaningful way along a path and not only at certain times? So I'd suggest that if we want to get into this and really develop this idea of the social commons, that we have to really and truly educate people about what social commons are. The fact that it does involve the state, but we also have to be mindful that in doing this thing about having community groups and so on, that we are clear that this is within a framework of mutual respect, and respect, especially nowadays, for nature. And that the things we do are going to be incompatible, if we're talking about social commons, that they're going to be incompatible with this highly commercialized and profit-making activity. So those are just some initial thoughts that you may want to explore in your own spaces about developing the concept and making social commons a reality.
Excellent, great response. And I really appreciate the context you put it in, particularly. I mean, you spoke to the concept of the education, and if anything is my wish, I wish you could put that in a song and play it across the radio so all to hear. That is excellent. So thanks much for that response. And I'll go to Andre. Andre, you know, and this is you know, this will be the final question from among the panels, you know, and we have the whole concept of that social common good. And I know earlier you spoke to, you know, state capitalism. Looking in terms of that, how do you see these social commons, and even extending it to the collective action, whether it be ownership and different structures in terms of challenging the state capitalism that exists, and in terms of ironing out all or the inequities that exist?
All right, big question. So that's our state capitalism. Now, we have to face the reality that we exist in a capitalist environment. Okay, so where does the state come into play? First of all, the state has a role. The state is an active participant on one hand, and the state also has to be a regulator on the other hand. Capitalism cannot take care of all the needs of society. So capitalism is based on profit. So certain goods can be satisfied through capitalism, and there's no need for the state to intervene in the provision of certain goods. So people need graduation ball gowns, and people need luxury vehicles. The state doesn't have to provide that. The capitalist system could take care of that, price it accordingly, and who could afford it, have it, who can't. That capitalism takes care of that beautifully. Water. Water is a basic need. Everybody needs water. If water is attempted to be provided under the capitalist model, it will fail. It will result in a market failure, and not necessarily from an efficiency standpoint, but the profit motive will lean towards some people not getting their fair share or not getting adequately serviced because they probably can't pay the commercial rates for it. So the state must intervene to provide a good such as that. Now, can the state be involved in capitalism? Yes. If we take, and I'm going to use in Trinidad and Tobago, take the banking system, for example. The government of Trinidad and Tobago is the principal shareholder in the two largest banks in Trinidad and Tobago. The banking sector, at one point in time in our history, was almost exclusively privately owned. And it was privately owned by foreigners. They were extremely profitable. They had a good time. When the markets changed, and the markets changed for a host of reasons, it was international, the whole geopolitical environment, the local economic environment, but the environment changed and banks became less profitable. the foreign privately owned banks they quickly exited from our shores because it simply was not as profitable as it could be. Then they came back when things got better again. Fast forward to where we are today, where the Caribbean region has a lot of challenges, and the banks that are privately held, the foreign banks especially, are trying their best to exit this region. So, I mean, without even calling names, we know who they are. They have been reducing their footprint in Trinidad, Barbados, St. Lucia, the whole Eastern Caribbean. They have been trying to get out. The indigenous banks have been expanding and investing in the region. The two locally owned banks in Trinidad and Tobago have expanded both in Trinidad and in the region. All right, and we're seeing similar activities in the indigenous banks outside of Trinidad as well, investing in the region. So here's the state successfully embarking on capitalism. In Trinidad and Tobago, the government again own Hyatt Regency, own Hilton. So they are involved in private sector, in what is normally private sector capitalist type arrangements, and they can do it profitably. So there's no law that says governments can't be involved in capitalism. The problem is where we believe that, where we equate public involvement with inefficiency. That's not necessarily the case.
All right.
All right. Yeah.
Yes, but excellent. Thank you, 𝘑𝘶𝘴𝘥𝘢𝘺. I see a hand raised.
Yeah, just the final point about the market and the state. And I just want to emphasize here that if anything, the COVID crisis and the environmental crisis have shown us that if left to the market and to the capitalist system, we are heading towards the doom. So I think it has to become very, very clear. And the examples have shown us, that just to say that the market for erectile dysfunction drugs equals roughly 50% of the overall budget to combat malaria. And that's because we left it to the markets. So the state has to intervene, and the state and the societies have to intervene to actually determine the direction of our economies. We don't need more luxury goods. We actually need really to direct our economy towards meeting the basic needs of our societies and towards vital infrastructure for our societies that at the same time meets the environmental challenges that we have ahead. So I think we should take really a break from the fact that the state cannot interfere and really talk about a strong state that is working together with society and communities and trade unions to redirect the economy and really face the challenges that our generation is confronted with. Thank you.
Thank you as well. And well, Sister Sandra, as we wrap up, I know probably in a minute, we had a contribution from Andre and from 𝘑𝘶𝘴𝘥𝘢𝘺. I don't know if you would like to chime in on this discussion before I just, probably in a minute, just before I wrap up.
Certainly. Certainly, my final comment is actually a challenge to the Elma Francois Institute and the Cipriani College of Labor and Cooperative Studies to continue this conversation, this discussion, this debate with your current and potential students, because I think this is where we have to overturn the things that we've been hearing about the role of the state, the importance of common goods, as you seem to be in love with the term social commons, and have that debate. And I throw that out, a challenge to you, and to do that with your trade unions in Trinidad and Tobago, ensuring that you target the younger members of your unions.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. And with those words, I really want to thank my esteemed, distinguished panel. I really had a lot of fun engaging with them, albeit short, and, Andre Falby, Sister Sandra Messiah, Dr. 𝘑𝘶𝘴𝘥𝘢𝘺. I really stand humbled in the shade of your really robust and eye-opening presentations here this morning, and well, this evening where 𝘑𝘶𝘦𝘴𝘥𝘢𝘺 exists, you know. So I really want to thank you all for the discussion and really the challenge that you have placed at the feet of the Elma Francois Institute of Research and Debate. And the college willingly accepts all your challenges and really looks forward to having you in future debates. as you can know, I always say, once you can't measure it, you can't manage it. So, you know, probably in future debates that you all can observe the progress that we have made. And this session is just the second in this week for weeks webinar series. And tomorrow morning we will continue where we look at trade unions for just transition. And it will be happening between 9 a.m. and 11 a.m. Eastern Caribbean time. And I guess you all can insert that into your Google calendars, adjust it for whichever region in the world you may exist. So on that note, I really want to thank those persons who have been viewing. You can check in the chat area of the YouTube just to complete a feedback form as we continue this webinar series in commemoration of the centenary of George Weeks, a labor union leader in Trinidad and Tobago, and the impact being resonated across the world. This week for weeks continues as we move forward. So once again, thank you to all my panelists. Thank you for those who have joined us online from around the world. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe, and fill out the form. And we will see you tomorrow morning as we continue our discussion. Peace and blessings to all. Please keep safe. Thank you very much.
You're most welcome, and thank you too.
Very welcome. 𝘑𝘶𝘦𝘴𝘥𝘢𝘺. Andrew.
Okay, thank you. Bye.
Thank you.
Welcome,
Bye.
man.
Take care.
𝘑𝘶𝘦𝘴𝘥𝘢𝘺. Bye. Take care.
Bye.